3 in the morning smells like antiseptic and failure. Seattle General's ICU hums with machines that never sleep, and Natalie Hayes is one of them, a fixture on the night shift for 6 years running, her hands moving through the ritual of fluid replacement and vital sign monitoring with the precision of someone who has learned to disappear into routine. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that particular shade of institutional white that makes time lose meaning. She refills and 4 bag at bed 4, her finger steady as surgical steel despite the exhaustion that lives behind her eyes now. The patient coding in bed 6 flatlines at 3:17 a.m. The monitor screams. Once. Twice. A sound like electronic panic in a room that has heard it 1,000 times before. Natalie doesn't hesitate. She moves, not runs, moves, with the terrifying fluid precision of someone whose muscle memory was trained in conditions far worse than a climate-controlled hospital wing. The crash cart is there before anyone else reaches the doorway. 16 seconds. That's how long it takes her to assess, charge, defibrillate, and get sinus rhythm back. She doesn't shout for help the way they teach in nursing school. She simply states what needs to happen, and people do it. 14-gauge angiocath. Second try if you miss. Her voice doesn't rise. It doesn't need to. The resident's hands shake as he slides the needle in. Natalie's don't. She's already moving to the next crisis, already calculating oxygen saturation and cardiac output and a dozen variables that live in the subconscious knowledge of someone who has worked in conditions where you don't get to call a code team because you are the code team. The patient stabilizes. BP climbing back into viable range. She wipes her hands on her scrubs and steps away from the bed as if she has simply checked a task off a list. I'm going on break, she says, and her tone is so flat that the newest resident thinks she's joking until he realizes she is not. The medevac alert comes through at 4:43 a.m. Trauma incoming. Air Force Colonel, 38 years old, unconscious with penetrating thoracic trauma. Shrapnel lodged in the anterior mediastinum, which means near the heart, which means this man's time is measured in hours if the bleeding starts, minutes if he moves wrong. The information comes through the overhead in the calm, efficient tone that hospital staff uses to announce the end of someone's normal life. Natalie is waiting when they wheel him in. The gurney comes through the trauma bay doors with the kind of controlled urgency that tells her the paramedics know they are transporting someone who is more fragile than he looks. There are 6 staff members present. Natalie is the only one who doesn't look at the monitor. She looks at him. At his face, scarred along the left cheekbone, jaw angle that cuts like his bones were forged in something harder than biology. At his uniform jacket draped over the foot of the gurney, the fabric torn in 2 places, one side darkened with blood that has dried to the color of old pennies. She reaches for the jacket as they transfer him to the bed. Leave that, someone says. The attending physician, a man named Chen who has been at Seattle General for 4 years and doesn't know her yet. But Natalie is already holding it. Already turning it over in her hands with a gentleness that doesn't match the efficiency of her movements. The inside lining is worn, familiar in a way that makes her fingertips stop moving. There, sewn into the fabric with military precision, the kind of stitching that comes from hands that have learned to make things last, is a unit patch. Faded. Frayed at the edges. But unmistakable. The same patch that hung in her footlocker for 20 years, the same insignia she wore sewn into uniform sleeves in a desert where the temperature hit 127 degrees by noon and the sound of incoming fire sounded like the sky was ripping open. Her hands go still. She raises her eyes to his face, and something in her chest cracks open like a fault line. The scar tissue on her left shoulder, tissue she has not allowed herself to think about in 2 decades, suddenly seems to remember where it came from. She sees the boy in the man, the 8-year-old Afghan interpreter with eyes too smart for his age, the one they called Saqib, the one who translated between 2 languages that neither side fully understood. She dragged him from a burning Humvee outside Marjah on a Tuesday in October when he was still small enough to carry with one arm. That was 20 years ago. Nurse Hayes. Chen's voice carries the faint edge of instruction. We need to move. She sets the jacket down on the chair beside the bed with the care of someone placing something sacred. Her hands are trembling. She watches them shake as if they belong to someone else, as if shock has temporarily severed the connection between her brain and her body. 20 years of burial, or of scrubs and overtime shifts and the deliberate construction of a life that asks no questions and reveals nothing, and one faded patch sewn into a jacket lining has unmade all of it in the space of a heartbeat. The imaging comes back at 5:22 a.m. CT scan, chest X-ray, focused assessment with sonography for trauma. The results appear on the monitor like a medical jury with a predetermined verdict. Shrapnel. Multiple fragments. One lodged 2.3 mm from the pericardium, the sac that holds the heart. Any movement, any sudden shift in pressure, any miscalculation in the next 72 hours, and the colonel becomes a bleeding casualty on an operating table. Dr. Ashford arrives at 6:41 a.m. when the morning shift begins. He is a man who carries his authority the way some men carry cologne, as an announcement that precedes him. Tall. Silver-haired in the manner that suggests expensive maintenance. His reputation was built on three things: connections to the hospital board, an enviable record of surgical outcomes accomplished through conservative protocols, and an absolute unwillingness to take any risk that might tarnish either of those things. He moves through Seattle General like a man who has never been questioned, which, based on the way staff parts before him like water around a stone, might actually be true. He is accompanied by two residents who carry themselves with the particular anxiety of junior physicians in the presence of a superior who expects competence without mercy. "Review for me," Ashford says, and it is not a request. He uses the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed instantly. The resident fumbles through the presentation. 23-year-old colonel. Fighter pilot, which means his blood pressure baseline is probably elevated, which means he's already operating in compensation mode. Shrapnel. Multiple fragments. Lodge dangerous and deep. Blood loss stable for now, but the moment that shrapnel shifts even fractionally, they're looking at catastrophic hemorrhage, cardiac tamponade, death in minutes. Ashford stands at the foot of the bed with the colonel's chart in his hands, and his face undergoes a transformation so complete that it looks like a different person is suddenly wearing the same skin. Clinical. Distant. The look of a man who has already written the ending and is now simply waiting for the patient to catch up. Not operable, Ashford says. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. The words fall into the room like a verdict carved in stone. The risk profile is catastrophic. Shrapnel this close to the pericardium, this deep into the anterior mediastinum, attempting extraction would likely cause more damage than it prevents. We'd be opening him up to bleed out on the table. The residents nod. The ritual is beginning. The ritual where a senior physician explains why a patient cannot be saved, and everyone else accepts the explanation because questioning it would require the kind of professional courage that doesn't grow in hospital hierarchies. Ashford continues, his tone never wavering from that clinical certainty. Make him comfortable. Order palliative care consultation. His family should be contacted. It is not a request. It is a command dressed up as medical guidance. Natalie stands at the monitors, her hands steady now, her face arranged in the expression she has perfected over 6 years of watching people make decisions that weren't hers to make. Her eyes move from Ashford to the colonel to the EKG tracing that shows a heartbeat still strong, still fighting, still present. Her shoulders are squared. Her breathing is even. She looks like a civilian nurse accepting the judgment of her superior, which is exactly what she is supposed to look like. What she looks like is not the same as what she is. The thing about composure is that it doesn't come from acceptance. Composure comes from knowing better. It comes from having survived things that doctors read about in journals but have never actually seen happen. It comes from muscle memory that has been trained in conditions where the alternative to keeping your hand steady is watching people die because your hands shook. Ashford leaves the room with his residents trailing behind like satellites around a planet. Natalie doesn't move for exactly 4 seconds. Then she approaches the colonel's bed and looks at his face, at the man the boy became, at the evidence that he lived, that he survived whatever came after Marjah, that he became something strong enough and important enough to wear the insignia of an Air Force colonel. She reaches down and grips the chair where his jacket is draped, and her hands start trembling again, but this time it isn't shock. This time it's something else. Something that lives in the space between knowing better and staying silent. Something that knows exactly what can be done in a combat field with limited resources and hands that have been trained to make impossible choices. The sound of his heartbeat continues steady on the monitor. Regular. Persistent. Alive. And Dr. Ashford has just told everyone in the hospital that it needs to stop. Dr. Ashford enters the colonel's room like a man arriving at his own coronation. His white coat is pristine, starched into submission. Behind him come two attending surgeons and the chief resident, their body language already resigned. Natalie stands in the corner near the monitors, hands folded, watching the sister's face crumble as she grips her brother's unconscious hand. The sister is maybe 30, red-eyed from 4 hours of weeping in the waiting room. Her name is Amira. She hasn't left his bedside since he arrived. Dr. Ashford positions himself at the foot of the bed like a surgeon about to deliver a verdict from on high. His voice carries the smooth weight of a man who has never been questioned twice. Ms. Amira, what I'm about to tell you is difficult, but it's the most honest assessment your brother will receive anywhere in this country. He pauses, letting the authority settle. The shrapnel fragment is lodged 3 mm from the left anterior descending coronary artery. Any surgical approach would require handling tissue that is essentially booby-trapped. One slip. One tremor. And your brother dies on the operating table. He glances at the two surgeons flanking him, both nodding with rehearsed solemnity. I've practiced cardiothoracic surgery for 23 years. These colleagues have combined experience of 48 years. And we are unanimous. Surgery is not an option. Amira's face goes white. What we can do, Ashford continues, his voice now dripping with the false compassion of a man performing sympathy, is keep him comfortable. Palliative care. Pain management. Time with family. He places a hand on Amira's shoulder, the gesture practiced and hollow. I know this isn't what you hope to hear. Natalie watches the vitals on the monitor above the bed. Oxygen saturation hovering at 88%. Heart rate irregular. The colonel's chest rises and falls in the shallow rhythm of a body fighting to survive. She sees the faded unit patch visible at the neckline of his hospital gown, the one sewn inside his jacket, the same patch she remembers from 20 years ago, when that boy was 8 years old and his Humvee caught fire in Marjah. She takes one breath. Dr. Ashford, she says quietly. Her voice doesn't waver. I've seen a similar shrapnel placement addressed with a modified thoracotomy approach in field conditions. If we access from the left lateral position and use a satin sky clamp to isolate the artery first, before. Ashford's head snaps toward her like a predator sensing movement. His eyes go flat. Nurse Hayes, are you seriously standing in this room and suggesting you know better than 5 board-certified specialists? The silence that follows is the kind that makes fluorescent lights seem impossibly loud. This, Ashford says, turning fully to face her now, his voice dropping into a register that carries contempt like a weapon, is exactly what I've been documenting. A nurse with delusions of competence. He gestures to the two surgeons, who have begun examining their shoes with sudden intense interest. You change bedpans. I save lives. Or would save them, if the case were survivable. He turns back to the residents assembled near the corner. Make a note. Nurse Hayes just demonstrated exactly why we don't take medical advice from clipboard carriers. Amira's head turns toward Natalie, and the look in her eyes is the look of someone who has just watched this nurse volunteer to murder her brother. One tear escapes Natalie's eye. It rolls down her cheek in a single perfect line. She doesn't blink. She doesn't look away. She wipes it with the back of her hand, her gaze locked directly on Ashford's face, and says with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst, that boy survived because I didn't wait for permission then either. The room goes dead silent. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, indifferent to the collision of wills happening above the bed. Ashford's jaw clenches. A muscle works beneath his skin like something trying to break free. He has no response to this. No institutional authority to wield against a fact delivered in perfect composure. Amira's expression shifts. Confusion flickers across her face. She looks at Natalie differently now. Not as the nurse who just volunteered to kill her brother, but as someone who has just said something that makes no sense in this context, and therefore might mean everything. Ashford exits without another word. The surgeons follow like remoras trailing a larger fish. The break room the next morning is where things truly begin to fracture. Natalie sits at the worn table with her coffee, black, cooling in a ceramic mug that has been through 1,000 dishwashers. 2 nurses she has worked with for 3 years are standing by the refrigerator. When they see her, they exchange a glance. One mutters something about needing to check on a patient. They both leave. The door swings shut. The coffee tastes like copper. By Wednesday, the pattern has crystallized. Residents won't make eye contact in the hallway. A nurse she covered for during a family emergency stops responding to her texts. The attending who once thanked her for catching a dosage error that could have killed a patient now takes his lunch break when she enters the cafeteria. By Friday, there is a formal write-up on the unit board in the main hallway. 20 nurses and residents will see it over the course of the day. 3 will take photographs. Nurse N. Hayes, written warning, inappropriate challenge to physician authority. The words are printed in the clinical font of hospital bureaucracy, which makes them feel factual. Institutional. Unchallengeable. That afternoon, Ashford calls her into his office. The office is exactly what you would expect: leather-bound medical journals he has never read, a photograph of himself shaking hands with a hospital board member, a window that looks out over Jacksonville's eastern corridor. He's smiling when she enters. It's a smile like a wolf showing its teeth. "Natalie," he says, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "May I call you Natalie?" He doesn't wait for an answer. "I've been thinking about our interaction in the Colonel's room. And I think we need to be honest about what's happening here." She sits. Her hands are steady. "You're experiencing what psychologists call the hero syndrome," Ashford continues, his voice reasonable, almost kind. The worst kind of condescension is the kind wrapped in concern. A need to save people. To be needed. It's not uncommon in nursing. Particularly in nurses who don't have other outlets for their need to feel significant. He leans back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. But it's a liability in a hospital setting. When you start believing you know better than physicians, when you start second-guessing medical decisions to patients' families, it becomes a safety issue. Natalie doesn't respond. "So I've made a decision," he says. "You're being reassigned to the psych ward. Effective immediately. You'll be working with mental health patients, which might give you some perspective on your own psychological patterns. And it will keep you away from my surgical cases, which frankly, was always inappropriate." He stands, signaling the meeting is over. His voice is clinical, final. "Your new schedule starts Monday. Security will be instructed to revoke your access to the ICU and surgical floors. You'll need to return your badge for recoding." Natalie stands. She's gathered her things and turned toward the door when Ashford speaks again. "Oh, and Natalie? Don't make me regret this. There are hospitals all over the country. But there are also a lot of ways for a nurse's career to end before it should. It isn't a threat wrapped in institutional language. It's a threat delivered in plain English from a man who has just moved from social attacks to strategic isolation." She leaves without responding. That night, she sits in her car in the parking lot for 3 hours, staring at the hospital's east wing. The Colonel is somewhere in that building. Deteriorating. Abandoned by 5 doctors who had already written his conclusion in their charts. And she is locked out. By the 4th night, the monitors in her head won't stop screaming. The 4th night, the monitors in the ICU screamed. Natalie stood in the break room, coffee untouched, staring at the clock on the wall. 11:47. She could see the Colonel's room from the corridor window, 17 beds away, separated by reinforced glass and Ashford's handwritten restriction order taped to the door frame. No nursing staff named Hayes. Her name was radioactive now. 72 hours had passed since Ashford locked her out. 72 hours of watching 5 doctors move through that room like pallbearers at a funeral they'd already scheduled. The first had been Ashford himself, day 1, standing at the bedside with a CT scan glowing on the monitor. The shrapnel fragment, a jagged shard of helicopter fuselage, the radiologist said, sat 3 millimeters from the left anterior descending artery. Operable? No. Wise? Absolutely not. Ashford had documented his refusal in the chart with the precision of a man building a monument to his own caution. Natalie had watched him do it from the observation room, her badge revoked from the ICU, her voice recorded as having challenged physician authority. The write-up was still on the unit board. She hadn't taken it down. Day 2 brought Dr. Chen and Dr. Rodriguez, the attending cardiothoracic surgeons who'd trained together at Johns Hopkins and shared an office on the hospital's 3rd floor. They'd examined the colonel side by side, reading the images like a pair of art critics studying something obscure and dangerous. Chen's thumb had pressed against his lower lip while he thought. Rodriguez had shaken his head once, a small movement, almost pitying. They'd conferred in low voices for 16 minutes, Natalie had timed it, and then they'd walked out without consulting the chart again. The word was inoperable. It had been written on their faces before they said it aloud. The chief of staff came on day 3, Dr. Malcolm Voss, a man whose hair had gone silver at exactly the right time to convey distinguished rather than old. He'd spent 4 minutes examining the colonel, 2 minutes reading the imaging, and then he'd left. His note in the chart was 2 sentences long. Palliative care. Comfort measures. The shrapnel stays. Day 4 was the visiting specialist, a cardiac surgeon from Denver who'd lectured at conferences Natalie would never attend. He'd flown in for a symposium on trauma medicine, and Ashford had invited him to view the colonel as a curiosity, look at this impossible case. The specialist had glanced at the CT scan the way someone glances at a lottery ticket they know is a loser. Unwise to attempt, he'd said. Extremely high risk of exsanguination. The fragment's mobility was the problem, millimeter shifts with each breath, each heartbeat. 1 slip. 1 tremor. 1 moment of imprecision and the left anterior descending artery opened like a mouth screaming. 5 doctors. 5 refusals. All documented. All airtight. What they didn't know was that vitals didn't care about consensus. Natalie had been tracking the colonel's numbers through the wall, watching the monitors change color, green to yellow to orange, from her enforced exile. His oxygen saturation was dropping, 94, 92, 89. His heart rate had gone irregular, skipping beats like a record with a scratch. The fluid around his lung was accumulating, a dark shadow spreading on each successive chest X-ray. The shrapnel was moving. Shifting with gravity and respiration, migrating toward something vital the way predators migrate toward water. She finished the coffee she hadn't drunk. Checked the clock. 11:53. The night shift had thinned out by now, most of the senior staff on other floors, the ICU staffed by residents and 1 nursing supervisor who barely knew her name. That was the design. Ashford's design. He'd rewritten the schedule himself, pulling Natalie's shifts, adding observers to any unit where she might appear, filing restrictions that made her presence on the cardiac floors equivalent to a security breach. He'd been systematic about it, efficient. Not the vulgar escalation of his humiliation tactics. This was execution. This was strategy. Her locker was in the break room, 3rd shelf down. She opened it slowly. Her name was still taped to the door in peeling white letters. Inside, folded at the bottom, sat the combat medic kit she'd carried through Marjah, through Paktia, through a dozen villages where electricity was a rumor. Sutures. Hemostats. Chest tubes. Medications in sterile packets labeled with the dates they'd been restocked. 20 years old. Never used since the day she'd washed the blood from her hands and buried the uniform in a storage unit in Seattle. The crash cart alarm went off on the 3rd floor. Natalie closed her eyes. Not him. Not yet. Then the monitors changed. She knew it without looking. 17 beds away, behind reinforced glass, the colonel's heart rhythm destabilized. The monitor would show it first, the sine wave becoming erratic, becoming wrong. Then the blood pressure would follow, crashing like a building with its foundation kicked out. Then the oxygen saturation would plummet because a heart that wasn't beating properly wasn't pushing blood to lungs that couldn't exchange oxygen anyway. Natalie was moving before conscious thought caught up. She grabbed the kit. Her hands were steady. Steady as a sniper's breath. Steady as the hands that had held a boy's chest cavity open while bullets came through a burning Humvee. The kit was light in her grip, familiar as a heartbeat. The ICU doors had a security badge reader. She didn't have access. She also didn't stop. She pushed through the regular door behind an orderly carrying empty bags, let it close soft, and then she was inside. The monitors sang their alarm song. Code Blue. The announcement would come, it always did, but first there was the chaos of those first seconds when no one moved because everyone was waiting for someone else to know what to do. Dr. Kim was at the bedside, first-year resident, and he was looking at the monitor like it was a language he'd forgotten how to read. His hands hovered over the colonel's chest, trembling faintly. Shock wasn't incompetence. Shock was recognizing that the textbook answers all said the same thing, wait. There was nothing to do. The shrapnel had migrated. The left anterior descending was compromised. The colonel's heart was filling with blood from inside its own walls. His coding, I don't know, the shrapnel shifted, Kim's voice cracked like he was still in medical school, still thinking this was solvable by memorization. Natalie moved to the monitor. The rhythm was chaotic, irregular, the electrical signal of a heart losing its synchronized purpose. Cardiac tamponade. The shrapnel hadn't nicked the artery, worse. It had punctured the pericardium, the protective sac around the heart. Blood was filling that space, compressing the muscle, squeezing the chambers until they couldn't contract. 3 minutes until irreversible brain damage. Maybe 4 if the colonel's youth was still working for him. She didn't speak to Kim. She opened her locker kit on the bed beside the colonel, unrolling the instruments in their sterile packets. Hemostats. Chest tubes. Sutures. Antiseptic. The tools of field medicine, the language of keeping people alive when surgery was an 8-hour flight away. You can't, that's, Kim's eyes went the size of golf balls. Get me a chest tube kit and 2 units O negative. Now. Her voice was command. Not inflection. Not request. The kind of voice that came from authority that wasn't arguing. Kim ran. Dr. Soto, the other resident, appeared in the doorway, froze when he saw what was happening. His mouth made shapes. His brain was calculating liability, protocol violation, the career implications of assisting in what Ashford would call an unsanctioned procedure. If you're staying, scrub in. If not, get out. Soto scrubbed. Natalie prepped the colonel's chest with betadine, painting the skin in concentric circles, watching the color spread like a sunset she didn't have time for. The scalpel from the crash cart was sharp. Good. Sharp is merciful. She made the incision at the 4th intercostal space, extended it with trauma shears from her kit, the blades opening the ribs with the sound of cutting bone, a wet snap that the untrained heard and forgot but the trained heard and never could. Kim returned with supplies, for bags and tubing, his hands shaking badly enough that he nearly dropped the chest tube kit. Natalie took it without judgment. Shock and fear were different from incompetence, and she needed him functional. Soto, suction. Keep it clear. She performed the field thoracotomy with the precision of someone who'd done it when the alternative was a man dying in the dirt 17,000 kilometers away. The rib spread. The lung collapsed away from the operative field. And there, the pericardium, distended like a water balloon, dark with blood accumulating inside. She opened the sac. Blood spilled. She suctioned. The heart was visible now, beating weakly, inefficiently, the chambers compressed by the weight of its own bleeding. The shrapnel glinted in the overhead light, a shard no bigger than her thumbnail, embedded in the pericardial lining like a piece of hell that had found its way into a body that didn't deserve it. She extracted it with hemostats, slow and controlled, her movements the calculus of precision and speed. The fragment came free. She irrigated the space. Checked for bleeders. None. The damage was contained. She placed the chest tube, positioned it to drain the remaining blood, sutured it in place with movements that had no wasted motion. The colonel's heart rhythm returned. Not normal, that would take time, medication, the body's own repair mechanisms. But it returned. The sinus rhythm, steady and purposeful, came back to the monitor like a prayer answered. His oxygen saturation climbed. 67, 74. 81, 88. Into safe territory. His blood pressure stabilized. His color came back to something approximating living. Kim exhaled like he'd been underwater for 3 minutes. The door burst open. Dr. Ashford stood in the frame, street clothes, called in by security the moment the alarm sounded. His eyes moved across the room, the open chest, the bloody instruments, the monitor showing stable vitals where there should have been flat line. His eye settled on Natalie's steady hands, still working, still precise, still healing. Get her out of here. His voice was low. That made it worse. Low voices come from people with institutional power, from people who've never had to shout to be obeyed. Security. Now. Security came. 2 men in uniforms, faces blank with the professionalism of people doing a job they'd done before and would do again. They didn't touch her roughly. There was no need. Natalie stepped back from the bed, washed the blood from her hands at the sink with methodical care, and turned to face them without resistance. She looked at the colonel. His eyes were still closed. But his chest was rising and falling. The shrapnel was gone. The bleeding had stopped. The heart was beating. She'd done what needed doing. Everything else was consequence. The security officers escorted her to the elevator. The doors closed. As they descended toward the lobby, she caught her reflection in the polished metal wall, blood on her sleeve, the combat medic kit still in her grip, her face the color of someone who'd seen exactly what she expected to see. The real nightmare was only beginning. The alarm screamed at 2:11 a.m. Natalie heard it from the break room where she'd been sitting alone for 3 hours, staring at the photograph of her team. 8 faces. Only 2 breathing anymore. The others were names on a wall at Arlington. The cardiac monitor's shriek cut through the fluorescent hum like a blade through silk, and her hands moved before her mind caught up. She walked past security without looking at them. Security didn't stop ghosts. She'd become very good at being invisible, 6 years of practice, 6 years of learning to take up the smallest possible space in a uniform that didn't belong to her anymore. Her locker was in the basement, behind the employee break room, stuffed with things she'd never unpacked, a combat medic kit that still smelled like desert sand and copper. Still smelled like Marjah. Still smelled like the boy she dragged from a burning Humvee when his intestines were hanging out and his eyes were open but seeing nothing. The kit weighed 14 pounds. She'd carried it for 3,000-odd days without opening it once. She carried it now. The ICU doors burst open and the world contracted into surgical focus. Dr. Kim, first-year resident, trembling hands, eyes wide with the particular terror of watching a patient die on your watch, stood frozen beside the colonel's bed. The monitors screamed a story Natalie read fluently, blood pressure 68/34, oxygen saturation 61 and dropping, heart rate 178 and climbing. The shrapnel had shifted. Cardiac tamponade. The pericardium was filling with blood that had nowhere to go. The shrapnel's moving, Dr. Kim stammered. I called Dr. Ashford, I called cardiothoracic, but his voice cracked. He's dying. Step back, Natalie said. She didn't ask. She didn't request. Her voice dropped an octave, the voice of someone who'd stood in sandstorms and pulled people from burning metal while rounds snapped overhead. The voice of Major Natalie Hayes. Dr. Kim moved without thinking. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. Steadiness wasn't courage. Steadiness was just muscle memory. The body remembering what the mind wanted to forget. She opened the kit. Sterile field. Local anesthetic. The scalpel gleamed under the ICU lights like something sacred. The second resident, a woman named Delgado, eyes locked on Natalie's face with a kind of focused attention that meant she understood, somehow, that she was watching someone slip from one world into another, positioned a drainage tray. Left anterior lateral thoracotomy, Natalie said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. Between the 5th and 6th ribs. I need hands on retractors the moment I'm through the muscle wall. There was no discussion. No committee. No protocol committees or ethics reviews or 5-doctor consensus about what couldn't be done. There was only the body, the tools, and the knowledge that lived in her hands. She made the first incision and the muscle separated like water. Her hands found the ribs, familiar, intimate knowledge, and she could feel the emergency of it, the way the intercostal space told her everything. Delgado and Dr. Kim retracted without being told twice. The pericardium appeared, distended and purple with blood under pressure. Wrong color. Dying color. Pericardial window, Natalie said. Scissors. The membrane released with a hiss, air escaping from a pressurized space. The blood drained into the tray, dark and viscous. O2 sat ticked upward. 65, 72. 78. The shrapnel lay against the left ventricle like a curse. Natalie had removed shrapnel in the field before, in sandstorms, in convoy vehicles, while rounds punched through the aluminum walls like they were paper. She knew the angle. Knew how hard she could press without perforating the heart wall. Knew the exact geometry of extraction. Delgado handed her the forceps without being asked. The shrapnel came free. Jagged. Maybe 3 inches long. Maybe enough to have killed him if it had shifted 2 millimeters to the right. Natalie placed it in the tray and looked at the wound. Clean. Viable. The colonel's blood pressure rose, 82, now 88, now 94/56. O2 saturation, 88. 92, 96. Sinus rhythm. Normal. Alive. Dr. Kim was breathing again. Delgado was crying silently, her hand still on the retractors, her eye still fixed on Natalie's face like she was looking at something impossible. The doors burst open and Dr. Ashford stopped in the threshold. His face was pale, then red, then a color that might have been neither. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. For 3 seconds, the silence was thick enough to operate in it. He just stood there, staring at his patient who was not supposed to survive, at his inoperable case, at his medical decision reversed by a civilian nurse with a combat knife and steady hands. Then the security guards were there. 2 of them, moving fast, and Natalie didn't resist because resistance was a choice and she'd already made her choice when she walked past security with a locker key in her pocket. Her hands were still bloody. The colonel's blood. The blood of a boy she'd pulled from a burning Humvee 20 years ago, now a man, now alive, now saved by the person he didn't remember saving him. She just saved his life, Dr. Kim started to say. His voice cracked like he was still trembling. She just committed assault, Ashford said. His voice was ice. His face had gone white again, the anger underneath showing like bone through torn skin. Practicing medicine without a license. Endangering a patient. Performing an unauthorized surgical procedure. He pointed at Natalie as the guards pulled her backward, her bloody hands rising involuntarily. You're done. Not just here. Everywhere. The tone of his voice didn't change. It stayed flat and administrative and absolutely certain, the way people sounded when they were dismantling something. The way people sounded when they were erasing you. Natalie didn't fight them. She didn't pull away. She let the guards walk her through the ICU doors and down the hallway, and her reflection followed in the polished metal walls, a woman covered in blood, her combat medic kit swinging from one hand, her face exactly the same as it had been at 2:27 a.m. Composed. Functional. Already gone. What happened next happened in the architecture of bureaucracy and phone calls and a deliberate, calculated dismantling that unfolded over 72 hours like a building being demolished floor by floor. The first call came from Ashford to Seattle Grace's nursing director concerning professional judgment. Abandoned protocols. I cannot recommend her for any position involving patient care. The second call came from Ashford to Portland Memorial. Her application has been withdrawn due to conduct issues we're currently documenting. The third call came from Ashford to San Francisco General. By then, word was spreading through the informal networks that connected hospitals like synapses firing. A nurse had assaulted a patient. A nurse had performed surgery. A nurse had ignored physician authority. By the fourth hospital, they didn't even listen to his full explanation. The damage was done. He altered the surgical schedule. Natalie's name, which had appeared in the records as the primary surgical contact for the colonel's procedure, disappeared from the system entirely. He recoded the entire operation under Dr. Kim's name, noting only that he'd supervised the first-year resident. The records made it sound like Dr. Kim had performed the thoracotomy under Ashford's guidance. The records made it sound like protocol had been followed. The records made it sound like an emergency that had been handled by doctors. Then came the formal complaints to the state nursing board. Practicing medicine without a license. Patient endangerment. Insubordination. Undermining physician authority. The paperwork was meticulous. Ashford had built his reputation on board connections, and he knew exactly how to move through the system like someone playing chess on a board only he could see. By day 3, Natalie's phone had stopped ringing because there was no point in hospitals calling anymore. The termination letter came from the hospital administrator, a man named Robert Sinclair who'd never spoken to Natalie directly in 6 years and probably wouldn't have recognized her face if she'd passed him in the hallway. He handed it to her across his desk without reading it aloud, which meant he didn't have to watch her reaction. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. You have 10 minutes to clear your locker. 10 minutes. That's what it takes to erase 6 years. To erase a life. She put the cracked mug that said World's Okayest Nurse into a cardboard box. A dying succulent she'd kept on the shelf because it matched her energy level. The photograph of her team in Marjah, 8 faces smiling at a camera in 2003, only 2 of them still alive in 2024. And at the bottom, wrapped in a towel, the combat medic kit, the faded unit patch from the inside of the colonel's jacket, the only proof she'd ever been anything other than what she appeared to be. 3 days later, rain poured down on Jacksonville like a memory that wouldn't stop. Natalie stood at the bus stop on Duval Street, the cardboard box in her arms, her scrubs sealed in a trash bag at her feet. She was wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a grey hoodie, the kind of outfit that made her invisible again. That made her small. That made her into the woman she was supposed to be now. A bus pulled up, doors hissing open like a wound releasing pressure. The driver looked at her, waiting. She didn't move. She didn't know where to go because there was nowhere left to go. She'd been ordered to disappear after a black site extraction in Marjah went catastrophically wrong, the mission buried so deep that her service records were wiped, her decoration sealed, her very existence as Major Natalie Hayes erased by Pentagon order 20 years ago. She'd rebuilt a civilian life as a nurse at Seattle General. Quiet. Invisible. Safe. Now that was gone too. The bus doors hissed shut. The bus pulled away. Rain hammered the pavement like applause for something that shouldn't have happened. She didn't get on. Day 7. The monitor beeped its rhythm. The colonel's eyes moved beneath closed lids, then opened. They focused. They searched the room, found the young male nurse checking the fall line. His lips parted. His voice came out like gravel through a filter. Major Hayes. The nurse froze. His hand trembled on the saline bag. He looked at the computer screen, at Natalie's file flagged in red, a classified security clearance that shouldn't exist for any civilian nurse in Jacksonville. The kind of clearance that made IT departments call their supervisors. The kind that made security protocols scream. Within the hour, the conference room door opened and a man walked in who made the air pressure change. Navy SEAL Commander Marcus Reese. Not in dress uniform, in a polo shirt and cargo pants, the kind of casual that came from knowing he didn't need a uniform to hold authority. Behind him, two more operators. Behind them, FBI Special Agent Voss with a leather folder and a jaw like a granite counter. The hospital administrator sat rigid in his chair. He'd been summoned without explanation. Now he was getting it. The colonel waking up, Reese said, "That's the reason I'm here." 20 years ago, Major Natalie Hayes pulled 13 soldiers from an ambush in Marjah, Helmand Province. Coordinated fire, heavy casualties, she was attached to my team as a combat medic. Reese opened a photograph on the table. 8 faces. Young. Hard. The colonel, impossibly smaller in the image, maybe 8 years old. A local interpreter who'd become a man with stars on his shoulder. That 8-year-old was Colonel Rahman. Now pilot for JSOC. He's been petitioning the Pentagon for 6 years to declassify the Marjah mission so he could publicly thank the woman who saved him. That woman just worked nights in your hospital for 6 years and nobody knew. The administrator's face had gone the color of old tile. Agent Voss placed a laptop on the conference table. "Dr. Ashford," she said, looking at the security footage from the surgical suite. "Let's talk about what you did after this." She pressed play. The timestamp read 2:19 a.m. Natalie's hands, steady as surgical lasers, moving through the thoracotomy with the kind of precision that comes from having done it under fire. The colonel's vitals climbing, O2 sat rising from 68 to 82 to 91. The incision clean. The shrapnel extracted. The sinus rhythm returning. The save. Then Ashford arrived on screen. His face twisted. "Get her out. Security. Now." The guards reached for Natalie even as the colonel's stats continued to stabilize. Even as he lived. Even as she'd done what 5 doctors said was impossible. "You refused care," Agent Voss said, pausing the frame. "Major Hayes performed an emergency thoracotomy with a combat knife and a field kit while you were asleep. 5 attending physicians declared this patient unsalvageable. The patient is now stable enough for discharge. Which makes this footage evidence of patient abandonment. And this," she clicked forward to a timestamp at 4:15 a.m., "this is you entering the hospital server room with IT credentials you don't have, attempting to delete the security footage. Which is evidence of obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence." The door opened. The State Medical Board investigator. 2 hospital attorneys. The board chair, Dr. Margaret Chen, who'd supported Ashford for 15 years, walked in and sat down like she was walking toward a grave. "Let's start," the investigator said, with the 16 phone calls. St. Jude's. Mercy General. Every major facility within 200 kilometers. You told them Major Hayes was dangerous. Unqualified. A risk to patients. You altered her surgical records to remove her name from the thoracotomy. You filed complaints claiming she practiced beyond scope. The investigator opened a folder. It was thick. Those calls had consequences, Dr. Ashford. 3 hospitals rejected her application. 1 didn't even interview her. You destroyed a woman's career because she made you look incompetent. She had no authority, Ashford said. His voice came out thin. She's a nurse. Those protocols exist. She's a major in the United States Army Medical Corps, Voss interrupted, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. 23 years active duty. 3 combat tours. 2 Purple Hearts. A Silver Star. The Silver Star is for valor in action under fire. She earned it in the same operation where she pulled Colonel Rahman out of that burning Humvee. Voss leaned forward. You blacklisted a decorated combat veteran because she saved a patient you'd already given up on. Dr. Chen looked at Ashford like she'd never seen him before. You knew about her military service? No. There was nothing in her file. It wasn't. It was classified, Voss said. Pentagon order. She was black-sighted after an extraction went wrong. Her service records were sealed. Her name was erased. That's the only reason you didn't know who she was. She closed the folder. But you know now. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Ashford's lawyer put a hand on his arm. Ashford didn't move. His hand sat flat on the table. They'd started to shake. The investigator stood. Your medical license is suspended effective immediately, pending full investigation. This hospital is cooperating with the State Board, the FBI, and the Inspector General's office. 2 security guards appeared in the doorway. The same guards who'd removed Natalie. You'll be escorted from the building. Ashford stood, unsteady. His face had gone grey. The guards flanked him, not touching, but present. Boundary. Authority. The message clear. He walked out of Seattle General the way he'd come in, and he never came back. By the following week, his office was sealed with evidence tape. His name was removed from the surgical board. Former residents filed formal complaints about his conduct spanning 8 years. A nurse came forward about a case in 2019 when he'd refused a procedure, the patient had declined, and the patient had died a month later. The State Board expanded the investigation to cover 32 cases under his supervision. The investigation took 4 months. The medical board hearing took 2 days. The suspension became permanent by mid-November. 6 months later, in a strip mall parking lot off San Marco Avenue, a lawyer visiting her brother in Jacksonville spotted a folding table. White metal frame. A cardboard sign, supplemental insurance coverage of affordable plans. Behind it sat Dr. Ashford, his hair thinner now, his face leaner, his hand shaking as he made change for a customer. Polo shirt with a company logo. No stethoscope. No authority. Just a man at a folding table trying to sell insurance policies to people who probably saw right through him. The lawyer took a photograph. Sent it to her brother. Her brother sent it to a friend. The friend sent it to Natalie. She looked at the image for exactly 3 seconds, then placed it in the trash. That wasn't victory. That was just survival. There was a difference. 3 months later, she stood in the Pentagon in dress blues, the uniform she hadn't worn in 20 years, tailored to fit the woman she'd become. The room was small, private, attended by 11 people, Colonel David Rumman in full dress uniform, his eyes already wet before she entered. Commander Reese. Agent Voss. 2 members of her old team who were still alive, their faces weathered by 2 decades of missions. The hospital administrator. Derek Moss, the IT administrator from Seattle General who'd saved every frame of security footage and reported Ashford the same night. For Pentagon officials. Rahman stepped forward. A small blue box in his hands. He opened it. The combat medical badge gleamed under the fluorescent light. Silver and gold. The insignia of a soldier who'd given blood to save others. Major Hayes, Rahman said, his voice barely steady, 20 years ago, you pulled me out of a fire. You carried me 11 kilometers through hostile territory with rounds passing so close we both smelled the ozone. You told me I'd do great things. He stepped closer. You were right. But only because you did them first. He pinned it to her chest. Her hand moved to her pocket. The photograph of her team, carried every single day for 20 years, finally allowed to exist in the record. 8 faces. Only 2 alive. But documented now. Remembered. Real. She returned the salute, and her hand didn't tremble. It never would again. Outside the Pentagon, reporters waited with cameras. She walked past them like they were walls. She drove back to Jacksonville. Back to Seattle General. She walked into the ICU in her dress blues, and the staff stopped, stared, recognized something they hadn't had words for until now. She went to the break room, sat down. This time, no one left. A resident she'd never met asked, "Is it true, Marjah?" She nodded once. Major Hayes, a nurse, said quietly, her voice like respect finally given weight, "We didn't know. You weren't supposed to." Natalie stood. Looked at the room full of faces. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. She changed into scrubs and started her shift. Hit like if this story got you. And tell me, have you ever been underestimated at work, only to prove them all wrong? I read every comment. Subscribe if you haven't already.